Chapter 1, International Economics is Different. So we start off by thinking about, what's a nation? And nations are entities which come into being because the people within that area decide that they want to form a nation. They're not like regions, they're not like families. They are what we call sovereign. In other words, they're not an entity that can go bankrupt in the sense of being dissolved. They can be subsumed into other countries, but they do have their own identity. And this is where, economics and politics, political science actually overlap, because there's a lot of talk in politics about identities and how that leads to the formation of nations and community. So there's no such thing as a global police force, and I think people don't really understand that when they think about, for instance, the World Trade Organization or the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And there's no one that can enforce anything that the country might do unless it causes some kind of war. And then there is no kind of international police force to keep any country in check. So that is a nation. And most nations obviously put the interests of their own people first. In this country, we're seeing that currently with our current president. And many nations actually do what he is doing. They're less concerned about what other nations think about their actions, and they obviously do what they think is best for their citizens. Mostly because, of course, in most countries, if government's democratically elected, they are answerable to the citizens. And if they're not democratically elected, then they don't want to get overthrown by some kind of revolution or coup. And that means making sure you keep the people happy. So a nation, from an economic point of view, has its own currency, its own trading regime. That is, it has its own taxes maybe on imports or rules about what can be imported from outside, its own government taxation, and the spending within that country obviously is done by the government of that country. And lastly, its own laws of residence and its own citizenship laws. And that kind of sets the scene for the book, because in the book we talk about, or in the course we talk a lot about, the interaction between countries, and it's important to understand the political entity that the country is before you can start thinking about the economic relationship between countries. And continuing with that theme, he, or the author of this textbook, actually talks about 4 current controversies. And those 4 controversies frame the scope of what is going to be learned in this course. So firstly, the trade war of 2018-2019, and it's less so in 2020, but certainly it started in 2018. This is a trade war between the US and China, but there's also been a bit of a trade spat between the US and the European Union as well, which has not made such headline news, but it's also been occurring. That's the first. Immigration is the second. Immigration has become a big issue, not just in the US, but also in the European Union and in other countries too, like Australia. Brexit is the third. Brexit is now being passed through Parliament, and it's now been enacted as of January the 31st, 2020. That is Great Britain. Officially its name is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, or the UK, is no longer a member of the European Union. That process has been called Brexit. Lastly, China's exchange rate. China has an exchange rate which is not determined in a market. It's determined by the Ministry of Finance there in China. And like many things in China, because China is a one-party state, the Communist Party still rules China, or is in charge of the government there. But like many things in China, the exchange rate is fixed by the monetary authorities there. That's in contrast to other countries where the exchange rate is determined in a market. So the US's value, the US dollar's value, the US has the US dollar, of course, it's determined in a market. Let's talk about the trade war of 2018. By the middle of 2018, President Trump had initiated a trade war against China. And the rationale for doing this was the fact that we have, or the US has, a very large trade deficit with China, a smaller trade deficit with Mexico, much smaller, and a very small deficits with other countries. But they were used as evidence to support arguments for protectionist tariffs. Tariff is a tax on imports, and the withdrawal of the US from TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and also from the NAFTA, if the NAFTA was not renegotiated. The next sentence also talks about the TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the U.S. International Trade Commission's investigations into the washing machine and solar panel industries concluded that rising imports had harmed U.S. firms making these products. So, in other words, the US ITC claimed that there was grounds for imposing taxes on imports of those products to protect the domestic industry. Also, cases made to government and this particularly came from the steel industry. It also covered aluminum, though, that imports were threatening those industries and their ability to produce within the United States. And this was presented as a national security concern in the sense that steel and aluminum are essential for the production of things like tanks and planes and other products that are used in wartime. So the Trump administration slapped import tariffs on both steel and aluminum. Initially, there were some exemptions granted on imports from Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, and South Korea. South Korea and Argentina agreed to voluntarily limit their exports to the US, and Brazil agreed to quotas. Quotas are a quantity limit on the amount of exports that Brazil exports to the US. The US in 2018, halfway through in June, ended its temporary exemptions and imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum from all countries except Australia, where it had a trade deal already in place with Australia. By the way, this really upset the Canadians, and in particular, they felt particularly aggrieved at the fact that their steel was being taxed at such a high rate when they were trying to renegotiate the NAFTA agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement. In response to those US tariffs, most of the exporting countries to the US imposed retaliatory tariffs on US exports. So in other words, the Chinese have now imposed bans of soybeans, for instance, from the US, which is really hurting soybean farmers in the US. In response to that, the Trump administration has had to give handouts, so income support, what we call income support, to farmers of soybeans in the US, and other actions have had to be taken as well to support industries where foreign governments have imposed tariffs on the goods that we export to those countries. The ongoing discussions with the Chinese have actually resulted in a treaty, an agreement, which is called Phase 1. There's supposed to be a Phase 2 and a Phase 3 of that agreement. One of the things that has not been resolved is the claims by the US that the Chinese are stealing US intellectual property. That's inventions and product specifications, if you like. And that still has to be agreed upon in some kind of Phase 2 of any trade agreement that we make with China. The US brought a complaint against the Chinese to the World Trade Organization, WTO, alleging violation of intellectual property rules. In July of 2018, the trade war escalated, with the US imposing tariffs on those Chinese imports and the Chinese retaliating. Since then, by the way, in December of 2019, more tariffs were supposed to go onto Chinese goods, and because the Trump administration came to an agreement, this Phase 1 agreement, no extra tariffs were imposed on those Chinese goods. But there still are significant tariffs imposed on Chinese goods right now. Now, one of the things about the trade war is that it affects both producers, the producers of those goods and services, and goods in this case, within the US, but also it affects consumers, because many of the things that have been tariffed are used in the production of goods either in this country, or they're goods that are tariffed, and therefore there's been an extra tax imposed upon those goods, which obviously affects consumers in the US. What we find, if we look at theory, economic theory, is that trade should be beneficial to all. And the freer trade is, the better off everyone should be. So what we're seeing in the trade war is kind of contradicts economic theory to a certain degree. Immigration. About 260 million people, 3% of the world's population, live outside their country of birth. Obviously that means that 3% of the world's population at some point in the recent past has moved. For most industrialized countries, the percentage of the country's foreign-born population is high. Industrialized countries are particularly attractive places to go to because salaries and incomes tend to be higher than in non-industrialized or more agrarian or developing countries. Japan is an exception here because Japanese culture is extremely difficult to acclimatize to or to get accustomed to. And although Japan is a fun country to visit, the kind of norms, social norms that exist in China make it very difficult for a foreigner to basically blend in and be at home in a place like Japan. Many of the foreign-born are illegal immigrants. And in the US, we have roughly 25% of immigrants are illegal, or what we call undocumented immigrants. And immigration policies on behalf of the Trump administration, again, and the US in particular, have been set in place to reduce and to restrict immigration. Trump famously stated in his campaign in 2016 that he would build a big, beautiful wall between the US and Mexico to halt illegal immigration. Opponents of immigration stress a range of problems they believe rise from immigration, including general losses to the economy, the fact that immigrants use things like healthcare, schooling, and other government services, and therefore that creates a burden on the rest of the population because many immigrants do not pay taxes. Slow integration of immigrants into the new national culture, values, and language. Obviously, that depends on the country and on the difficulty of the language, etc. Potential of increased crime, and that is something that's heavily stressed by the Trump administration. And links of some immigrants to terrorism. It's been noted that some terrorists or terrorist acts that have occurred in the US and in Europe have come about through immigrants coming into those countries concerned, France being an obvious country in Europe to note. How much harm do immigrants do to the economies? Well, actually on the economic side, we can show, and it has been shown, there are net economic benefits, not only to the people who migrate, but also to the receiving country overall. Who wins? Where are these net benefits? Well, the net benefits come to the firms that hire those immigrants and the consumers who buy the products manufactured by those firms. It should be noted that many of the people who work for companies like Google, Google recruits heavily from abroad and then brings in what it considers the best workers in the world. So Google will go through all the immigration steps if it thinks you are the best candidate, regardless of where you live. The group that loses is the workers who compete with the immigrants for jobs. So if you're in an industry such as building where there's lots of immigrants coming in, obviously that's going to be a cause for concern for you because it means that you're competing against probably undocumented workers. Putting this together, the net effect, though, is positive. The winners win more than the losers lose. So in other words, there is a net benefit to the economy. Third most recent issue is Brexit. In 2016, voters in the UK voted 52% to 48% in a shock referendum to leave the European Union. And leave it after decades, something like 40 years being within the European Union. It was interesting that there were significant differences in the vote. So London, Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain. In particular, London and Scotland voted heavily to remain in the European Union. The rest of England, so areas outside of London, mostly voted to leave, and Wales also voted to leave. The thing with the United Kingdom, though, is the United Kingdom consists, as I hinted earlier, of 4 countries: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. That's why it's called the United Kingdom of Great Britain. That's the island which contains Scotland, England, and Wales, and Northern Ireland. So England, in terms of population, dominates the others. And London, although it's a big city, still is smaller than the rest of England and Wales together. So the vote narrowly went, and in a really quite shocking way, went to those leavers who wanted to take the United Kingdom out of the European Union. Those who were talking about staying, they stressed the economic benefits. The proponents of leave stressed British sovereignty. In other words, this idea that as a country you should be able to set your own policies without regard to any other entity. What needs to be resolved in this is what's going to be the status of the border between Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and Ireland. Now, he doesn't talk about it here, but the big problem here is that in the peace accord that has brought lasting peace to Northern Ireland, I don't know if you know the history of this, but Northern Ireland had a lot of violence in the 1970s, 1980s due to the Catholics and the Protestants. So it's based along religious lines, disagreeing about what should happen to the what's called Ulster, that is the provinces of Northern Ireland. The Republicans, the IRA, which stands for the Irish Republican Army, were a terrorist organisation, a militia group they would call themselves, who wanted to unify Ireland, in other words bring Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland together. The Protestants, who were part of the Ulster Defence League, I think it was called UDL or UDA, I can't remember exactly what the name was called, but they wanted obviously to stay with the rest of the United Kingdom and not be part of Southern Ireland or United Ireland. By the way, Southern Ireland is part of the European Union. So when the peace accord happened and Bill Clinton helped drive that accord, that peace treaty, one of the conditions was that there should be an open border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. But of course this did not envisage the idea that the two bits of Ireland, one would be in the European Union and the other bit would not be in the European Union. So that creates a problem. So the first bullet point there talks about the status of the border. Is it still going to be open? If so, and that's actually what's being proposed now, it's going to be an open border as of the end of this year, when the current transition period ends from being a member of the European Union to completely sovereign country. At the end of this year, we'll have to see whether a border gets put in place between Northern and Southern Ireland. Somehow I doubt it. I think what's going to be agreed is a border where things will be checked between Northern Ireland and the UK. Now, the Northern Ireland, particularly the Protestants in Northern Ireland, have strenuously objected to that. They feel that they're still part of the UK, and the border, if there is one, should be between Northern and Southern Ireland. But that would, of course, violate the conditions of the peace treaty. What tariffs and customs procedures will exist for trade between Britain and the EU? That's being negotiated right now. Also on track is a new treaty that's being proposed between Britain and the US, and that's something that President Trump has stressed. Will there be differences in product regulations and standards between Britain and the EU? The EU would prefer that there not differences in product regulations and standards, but the current Prime Minister Boris Johnson, has rejected that idea and said that there will be differences in product regulations and standards. That makes the EU very nervous. And how will these apply to trade? Well, obviously they are going to apply to trade if they are different. Will there be new barriers to trade in services? This is particularly important to the UK, which has historically been the centre of the financial world. It still is the centre of the foreign exchange market. More transactions, foreign exchange transactions, are done in London than in anywhere else in the world. So London still has this dominant role in the financial markets. So will there be new barriers to trade in services? And of course, doing financial services, those are by definition services. So especially, to what extent can London banks continue to sell financial services to EU firms and residents? Many EU countries and cities in those countries are kind of licking their lips and hoping that they're going to get a ton of business that was in London coming to their city. And in particular, Paris is making a big bid for that business, as is Amsterdam, as is Berlin. So 3 cities are heavily competing at the moment to try and get companies to move there. Now, some US banks have already said they're going to move out of London. So Goldman Sachs has already said they're going to leave a small office in London, but they're going to move their European headquarters over to, I think it's Frankfurt in their case, Frankfurt or Berlin, I forget now. Will Britain be able to negotiate its own free trade agreements with outside countries? Well, the answer to that question is yes, it will. It will not be able to benefit from the more than 35 free trade agreements the EU has with other countries. No, Britain is going to have to negotiate its own. Let me tell you that negotiating a free trade agreement does not take 10 minutes. You can go with an off-the-peg agreement, I suppose, but most agreements, and this is what Donald Trump prefers, he prefers bilateral agreements, so in other words, agreements between the US and specific countries, not some kind of regional agreement, which is the European Union is. What policies will oversee migration between Britain and the EU? It's likely that there will be migration between Britain and the EU. From what I understand, people from the EU are being invited to get residency in the UK right now. But from other countries, obviously Britain can have whatever regulations or rules it wants, because it will no longer be part of the European Union. The European Union migration supposedly is determined at the European level, not at the country level, or what they say in the EU member state level. To what extent will Britain continue to pay the EU? Well, Britain has to pay a divorce payment of £39 billion, and I believe that's being paid now. But after that's paid, that'll be it. There will be no more payments to the EU. China's exchange rate. What is an exchange rate? Well, it's the value of a country's currency in terms of some other country's currency. It's a relative price, in other words. So it's like the price of apples in terms of oranges. So you can express it either way. So apples per orange or oranges per apple. In 1994, the Chinese government switched from a system of several different exchange rates. These were different exchange rates dependent on the type of transaction that took place, to a fixed rate to the dollar. It locked in at about 8.28 yuan per dollar until 2005. By 2003, the US government began to complain that China's fixed rate policies was unacceptable currency manipulation. And the US has rules where it can declare a country a currency manipulator, and that allows then the US to put sanctions on the trade of that country with the US. And the US is the biggest trading country in the world, so that is something that most countries wish to avoid. So the US threatened large new tariffs on imports if the yuan wasn't revalued. In other words, the accusation against the Chinese is that they were keeping their currency way too low, so their products looked much cheaper than they should do when they were priced in US dollars. So the argument was that the Chinese should let the yuan rise in value. That means that the prices of those products would look higher in US dollars, but it would mean that US producers would have a chance of competing. Was there proof of manipulation? So in other words, was there proof that the exchange rate should have changed? Well, the Chinese government continually had to go into the foreign exchange market to buy dollars and sell yuan. In other words, the Chinese government had to manipulate the value of their currency in the foreign exchange markets to keep the currency fixed at that level, at that low level. So if they hadn't have done so, the actual yuan would have risen in price. So it shows that they did manipulate it to keep it low. So the exchange rate value was definitely too low, but the question is by how much? And this is a very difficult thing to pinpoint accurately, but the estimates came in were between 15 and 40%. But as I said, there are problems in making these estimates, and one of them is that China had substantial trade surpluses with the US. In other words, China exports more to the US than it imports from the US and the European Union, but had trade deficits with many other countries. So overall, China has a trade surplus. So in other words, it's difficult to say, where the currency should be so that China doesn't have a trade surplus or a trade deficit. It should be kind of trade neutral. China has a very high savings rate too, and that means that that money has to go somewhere, and it tends to go into US assets. Private speculators moved hot money into the country in hopes of profiting when the value of the yuan increased. So if you think the value of a currency is going to be moved upwards by government, then oftentimes speculators will move money into that currency so that they can take advantage of the increase in the value of that currency, particularly if it's a significant revaluation or increase in the value. 2005, the Chinese government changed the exchange rate value from 8.28 to 8.11, a revaluation of 2.1%. In other words, the US dollar is buying less Chinese yuan, therefore the Chinese yuan is stronger against the dollar. By 2008, the value of the yuan was 6.83 yuan per dollar, so even less yuan per dollar. So China implemented a steady fixed exchange rate for a couple of years, and China now still has a relatively fixed exchange rate. And I don't know what it is quite now, but you can easily look it up. As the world recovered from the worst of the global crisis from 2007 to 2009, China increased the value of the yuan by 15 to 30%. And 2010, it allowed even more increase. The yuan money supply in China grew too rapidly, though, encouraging local borrowing and spending that created upward pressure on the inflation rate. So by increasing the exchange rate value of the yuan, the Chinese government was able to better manage its domestic economy. It lowered import prices in China, reducing inflation pressures. As the value of the yuan goes up, it means their prices in US dollars look higher, but the opposite is therefore true as well. US dollar prices in yuan look lower. That reduces inflation pressures. It slows the growth of China's exports. So in other words, because Chinese prices are tending to look higher now to foreigners, it removes demand pressure on the prices of resources and products. It reduces the amount of intervention needed. Intervention meaning the buying and selling of the currency to make sure it has a fixed value, reducing the pressure for growth of the money supply. So the fact that nations have their sovereignty, their separate interests and their separate policies means that we have a world, a global economy where countries are sovereign. Those sovereign countries are having to come together to trade and to basically push the interests of their citizens on the global stage. And when it comes to those types of policies, governments have their own rules on things like international movements of resources, government taxation and spending, and money and exchange rates. What kind of things can we identify where the nation state does get involved? Well, factor mobility across borders would be a good one. So, what is a factor of production? Well, it's land, labor, capital. Land can't move over borders, so I don't know why he's put that there, but labor certainly can, and that's migration, of course. And capital meaning money in this case. Different fiscal policies. Different countries have different tax regimes, have different levels of government spending. And obviously the power to regulate is important as well. Each country has its own money unless they've decided to give it up, and some countries do decide to give up their own money. That's called dollarization or euroization. But most countries have their own money. And that's the end of that first chapter. Hope you enjoyed it.